Country Pride Grade A baking heads, 39 cents.
Popular at the time.
Savrin Coffee, $2.59.
Do you remember those cheap grocery items? The ones that quietly got us through when money was tight? In 1990s kitchens, these no-name boxes and powdered mixes meant full bellies, even when the fridge looked bare. Funny how something that once felt like struggle now feels like pride, isn't it? You either hated it, learned to tolerate it, or convinced yourself it was fine once it was cold. Dry milk in cardboard cartons was one of those things that sat on pantry shelves like an unspoken badge of struggle. You mixed it with tap water in a big plastic pitcher, stirred for what felt like forever, and waited for the foam to settle. It never tasted quite right. The color was just a little off. But it was there. It was milk, kind of. And when you could not afford the real thing, it kept your cereal from going dry. For a lot of families in the 1990s, this was not a backup. It was the only option. Fresh milk meant a trip to the store and several dollars you probably did not have. But powdered milk? That stuff lasted forever and worked in a pinch for everything from boxed macaroni to pancake batter. You learned to look past the taste. You stopped complaining because everyone else at school had milk and you were just glad to have something close. Moms mixed it with a little real milk to stretch the carton. Kids closed their eyes and drank it fast. And that little box in the cabinet reminded you what it meant to get by. It was weird, it was chalky, and it helped families survive. They sold it like a complete meal, but most of us just saw a box of dry noodles and powder and figured we would make it work. Hamburger Helper was a staple in 1990s kitchens, but not everyone had the hamburger part. That was optional. The box said, just add meat. But the truth was, if you had a box and some water, dinner was already halfway done. The cheesy powder, the flimsy elbow noodles, the tiny spice packet, it was all designed to stretch whatever scraps you had into something hot and filling. No ground beef? You used beans. A little leftover chicken? You shredded it real small. And sometimes, you just skipped the meat altogether and hoped the sauce would do the talking. It was salty, it was starchy, it was magic if you were hungry enough. You could find it for under $1, and the serving sizes were always generous. You ate it with cheap bread or frozen vegetables, sometimes both. It was the kind of dinner you made without needing to think, and that was part of its power. It showed up when your family needed something easy, something cheap, and something that would last a couple of days. Hamburger Helper without the hamburger was not glamorous, but it was comfort. And it reminded you how far a little food and a little grit could go. There was something about peeling back that freezer door and seeing that brick-shaped 5-pack of frozen burritos sitting in the frosted corner. You knew exactly what dinner looked like that night, and probably lunch the next day too. These were not gourmet. They were barely identifiable as burritos sometimes. A smear of bean, maybe a whisper of cheese, all wrapped in a tortilla that got hard on the edges no matter how long you microwaved it. But they were cheap. Dirt cheap. Less than $2 for 5 of them, and they filled you up faster than anything else in the frozen section. Kids could make them on their own. Parents could stretch them into a side dish, add a little salsa if they had it, maybe slice one open and pretend it was something more than what it was. The freezer always had a pack or two tucked behind the ice cubes. And somehow, no matter how bad they tasted, they hit the spot. Especially after school or on nights when money was too tight for takeout or even pasta. These burritos were survival food. They were microwave staples for latchkey kids and broke college students. They were dependable in a way fancier food could never be. You might not have bragged about them, but you were grateful. It came in a plastic tray with a packet of powder, a slick pouch of sauce, and dreams of an actual meal. Maruchan Yakisoba was the 1990s answer to, I want takeout, but I have a $2 bill and an old microwave. These things were everywhere, from gas stations to discount grocery stores, and if you were broke, they felt like a big step up from a plain pack of ramen. Just add water to the fill line, microwave it until your house smelled like steamed plastic and soy, then stir in the sauce. The noodles were weirdly soft, the sauce was super salty, and the tray always burned your fingers. But it worked. It felt like an upgrade, like fast food's dollar menu came to your kitchen. For teens with no allowance, or parents trying to keep grocery costs down, yakisoba bowls were a little moment of indulgence. They filled you up. They took no effort, and they made you feel like you were eating something with flavor, even if it was mostly sodium and MSG. Some kids ate these every day after school. Others lived off them in college. No one thought they were healthy, but no one cared. They were warm, filling, and just a little exciting, especially when you could not afford anything else. You opened the cabinet, grabbed the can with the plain label, and hoped today's batch had a little more meat than the last. Generic canned chili was a poor person's feast in the 1990s. Thick, sloppy, a little mysterious, and always hot. It came in a dented can with a no-name brand, and the ingredients list was vague at best. But it was food. You poured it over rice or crushed up saltines into it. You spooned it over a baked potato if you had one. Some people ate it cold straight from the can. The texture was questionable, the flavor was heavy on spice and light on substance, but it stuck to your ribs. You got a full stomach for about $1, and that was all that mattered. If you had cheese, great. If you had hot dogs, even better. But if all you had was the can, that was still enough to feed a hungry mouth. It became a go-to dinner on cold nights, a quick lunch before the second shift, or a last-minute fix when there was nothing else. Canned chili never tried to be fancy. And maybe that is why it earned a quiet kind of loyalty. It was always there when you needed it. The box was never flashy. No cartoon tiger, no sparkly prizes inside. Just a plain design, a generic name, and maybe a smiling bowl of cereal on the front. Store-brand cornflakes were the ultimate no-frills breakfast in the 1990s, and if your family was broke, it was probably the first thing you ate that day. They came in a huge box, usually cheaper than $2, and lasted all week. The flakes were thinner, a little more stale, and the flavor always felt like it was missing something. But they were there, with dry milk or regular milk, with sugar on top or plain. Some kids got creative and crushed them over pudding or mixed them with peanut butter. They were simple, boring, and weirdly comforting. Because when you woke up hungry, you did not care about brand names. You cared about food that was fast and available. And these cornflakes were always available. They showed up in school mornings, late-night snacks, and quiet weekends when there was not much else in the kitchen. You would never ask for them, but you would always eat them. That was the deal. And that big yellow box stood for something a little more than cereal. It stood for getting by. The tin crinkled when you peeled it open. The crust never browned quite right. And the filling? Well, let's just say it was a surprise every time. Frozen pot pies were the warm, slightly questionable answer to dinner in the 1990s if your budget was low and your freezer was full. Chicken, turkey, beef, whatever the flavor, it all kind of tasted the same. Salty gravy, tiny cubes of meat, a few peas and carrots, and that soggy, crispy crust combo you never quite figured out. But it was filling. It was hot. And it made you feel like you had a real meal on the plate. You could find them for under $1 each, sometimes on sale for even less. They took forever in the oven, but if you had the time, they were worth the wait. Microwave versions existed, but they always came out mushy. Parents bought them in stacks. Kids learned to love them out of necessity. And somehow, that little aluminum pie felt like a win on a hard day. It was not good food, but it was good enough. And for people getting by on tight margins, good enough was the gold standard. It did not need a can opener. It did not drip oil on your hands. Pouch-packed tuna was a quiet revolution in 1990s poor kitchens, a protein that was cheap, shelf-stable, and weirdly convenient. You could eat it straight from the pouch or mix it into whatever was lying around. Macaroni, rice, salad, crackers, tuna made it work. No draining, no mess. Just rip it open, squeeze it out, and stir. Some pouches were plain. Others came seasoned, maybe with lemon or pepper if you were lucky. But no matter the flavor, the idea was the same. Cheap fish that lasted forever and fed whoever was hungry. It was a step up from canned tuna because it felt a little easier, a little faster. You could keep a few in your backpack, your desk, even your glove compartment. People surviving on food stamps knew the value. Students and single parents kept it on standby. And even though it kind of smelled like cat food, It packed protein that helped you get through the day. It was weird, it was reliable, and it reminded you that survival sometimes came in a soft silver pouch. You did not need a recipe. You just needed boiling water and time. Pasta shells or elbow macaroni in bulk bags were the unofficial currency of 1990s broke kitchens. One bag could cost under $1 and stretch into multiple meals, more if you got creative. You boiled them up, drained them, then stared into the pot like a blank canvas. Add ketchup? Sure. Butter and salt? Definitely. Shred in whatever cheese you could find, dump on canned vegetables, or mix it with leftover meat from last week. It was not about flavor. It was about calories. It filled you up fast and kept you full longer than most boxed meals. Some people ate it plain. Others fried it in a pan the next day. It showed up on every grocery trip because it made sense. It was cheap, flexible, and absolutely essential. When you were low on money and lower on options, a big bag of macaroni was a form of security. You might not have known what dinner was going to be, but you knew it would start with pasta. They came in giant cans with awkward labels and colors that looked like they belonged in the back of a thrift store. But store-brand baked beans were a kitchen staple when money was tight in the 1990s. Sweet, sticky, mushy, and just barely holding together, they were the side dish that became a main course more often than anyone admitted. You dumped them in a pot or microwaved them in a bowl. Sometimes you added hot dogs. Sometimes you just ate them on toast or with a spoon. They were loaded with sugar and syrupy sauce, and somehow that made them feel like comfort, like something your mom made when there was not much in the pantry, but she still wanted to give you something warm. They were kid-friendly, adult-tolerable, and always available. The big can lasted for days if you were careful. And if your family shopped by price per ounce, beans were a no-brainer. These were the foods that made dinners stretch and reminded you that meals did not have to be fancy to count. The sound of the can opener twisting, the glug of that thick, sweet sauce hitting the pan, you already knew what was for dinner. Canned SpaghettiOs with meatballs were the kind of meal you could make when the fridge was bare and no one had the energy to cook. It was not glamorous, but for struggling families in the 1990s, it was fast, cheap, and something the kids would actually eat. The noodles were soft and squishy, shaped like little rings, and the meatballs were small enough to question whether they were really meat, but they got the job done. You heated the whole thing on the stove or in the microwave, dumped it into a bowl, and hoped the sugar and salt would cover up everything else. It was comfort food for people who could not afford comfort. At under $1 a can, it fed 1 or 2 people in a pinch. Some moms added shredded cheese or a slice of bread on the side to bulk it up. And for a kid coming home from school, tired and hungry, it was better than nothing. It was dinner. It might not have tasted like much, but it gave you something warm when the kitchen felt cold. SpaghettiOs with meatballs might be a joke to some people now, but back then, they meant survival. The commercial called it the San Francisco treat, but your kitchen called it dinner, only it probably came from the bottom shelf with a no-name label. Store-brand rice-a-roni was one of those meals you could stretch, remix, and rely on. It came in a cardboard box with a plastic pouch of rice and tiny noodles, plus a foil packet of dusty seasoning that smelled way better than it looked. You toasted the rice in oil or butter, if you had any, then poured in water and stirred until it bubbled up like magic. It was salty, it was savory, it was fake fancy. You could eat it plain, mix it with vegetables, or throw in some chopped up hot dogs if you were lucky. Some families would split a box between siblings and still make it feel like a full meal. It was not about flavor. It was about the feeling of sitting down with something warm and filling. The store-brand version saved you 50 cents, maybe more, and nobody really noticed the difference. In the 1990s, when groceries had to last and budgets were razor-thin, boxed rice like this was more than a side dish. It was a safety net. You saw it in pantries everywhere, and when the cupboards got low, you were grateful for it. You did not pick canned mixed vegetables because you liked them. You picked them because they were cheap, easy, and they counted. Peas, carrots, corn, lima beans, all floating in a cloudy liquid that smelled a little like metal and a little like school lunch. They came in big cans with plain labels, and they made you feel like you were doing the right thing, adding vegetables to the plate, even if no one wanted them. You dumped them into a pot, heated them up, and hoped the flavor would be better than last time. It usually was not, but you still ate them. Because canned veggies lasted forever, they were cheap, and they checked a box. Sometimes moms drained the liquid and fried them with a little butter to make them less mushy. Sometimes they got added to soups, stews, casseroles, anything to stretch the meal. They were not fresh, not frozen, and definitely not pretty, but they filled space on the plate. For struggling families in the 1990s, that was more than enough. You felt like you were eating something healthy, even if it barely tasted like food. It was another piece of the puzzle, another cheap staple that made sure dinner got on the table. They came in little plastic cups with foil lids that never peeled off clean, but nobody cared. Store-brand applesauce cups were the sweet break in an otherwise bland lunch. For poor families in the 1990s, these were the kind of snack you bought in bulk and tossed into lunchboxes without thinking. They were cheap, they lasted forever. And best of all, they counted as fruit, even if they were basically sugar and puree. The texture was a little too smooth, a little too artificial, but it was cold and sweet and easy to eat. Kids liked them because they were predictable. Parents liked them because they were shelf-stable and could stretch the food budget. You could buy a whole pack for just a couple of dollars, and it felt like getting 10 little treats for the price of one. Some versions had cinnamon, others were barely flavored, but either way, they made the meal feel finished. You could eat them on their own, mix them into oatmeal, or use them as dessert when there was nothing else. They did not scream luxury, but they whispered comfort. And for anyone scraping by, that was more than enough. A little yellow box, a bag of dry mix, add water or milk, maybe an egg if you had one, and you had something warm in the oven within the hour. Store-brand cornbread mix was the secret hero of budget meals in the 1990s. It was not fancy, it was not sweet like restaurant cornbread, but it filled your house with the smell of something home-cooked, and that mattered. You could bake it in a square pan, drop spoonfuls on a baking sheet, or pour it over chili to make a casserole. It was cheap, it was easy, and it made every meal feel just a little more complete. A slice with butter turned soup into dinner. A chunk with beans turned survival into something that almost felt like comfort. For $1 or less, that box gave you something you could be proud of. It did not take much, but it gave a lot. And for parents trying to feed kids with very little, it was one of the smartest buys on the shelf. The packaging was always thin plastic. The slices were wet, uneven, and sometimes stuck together like they were afraid to be seen. Discount lunch meat packs were not what you bragged about. But in the 1990s, they were what you bought when deli meat prices made your eyes water. These packs came with turkey, ham, or chicken that tasted vaguely like salt and preservatives. You made sandwiches with the cheapest bread and maybe a smear of mustard. That was lunch. That was survival. You could get a few sandwiches out of one pack, more if you tore the slices in half and spread them thin. School lunches were built on these. Dinner sometimes too. You ate them cold or warmed up in a pan for a fake hot meal. It was not about flavor. It was about the act of eating something that looked normal. That felt like a real lunch, even when it barely qualified. These packs made sure no one went hungry, even if the quality was rock bottom. They were strange, they were questionable, and they were there when you needed them. It came in a can with a picture of a messy sandwich and a name that sounded more like a cartoon than a meal. Sloppy Joe sauce was just tomato paste, sugar, and spices, but it transformed 1 pound of cheap ground beef into dinner for a whole family. In the 1990s, if you could not afford burgers, you made sloppy joes. If you could not afford buns, you used sandwich bread. And if you could not afford meat, you stretched the sauce with beans or lentils and hoped no one noticed. It was the kind of meal that fed everyone for a couple of bucks, and that made it golden. You browned the meat, poured in the sauce, stirred until it bubbled, then spooned it onto whatever bread you had. It was tangy, it was sweet, it was sticky, and for some reason, it always felt like a treat. Canned Sloppy Joe sauce made you feel like you were doing something more than just scraping by. It was messy, loud, and kind of fun. And sometimes that was exactly what you needed at the end of a long week. It was barely the size of a paper plate and cost less than $2. The cheese was weird, the sauce was watery, the crust was like chewing on cardboard with a crispy edge, and yet it was perfect. Cheap frozen pizzas, especially the personal-sized ones, were a saving grace for broke families and hungry teens in the 1990s. You tossed one in the oven, waited 15 minutes, and had something hot, round, and close enough to real pizza to fool your taste buds for a little while. No delivery, no tips, no waiting for coupons, just you and a meal that pretended to be indulgent. You could eat the whole thing by yourself and still feel like you had not broken the grocery budget. Some people added extra cheese or pepperoni from a separate pack. Others just ate it plain and burned the roof of their mouth like a badge of honor. It was not about quality, it was about access. And personal frozen pizza was the kind of small win that made the struggle feel a little lighter. They looked like the name brand. Kind of. Same shape, same color, but one bite in, and you knew these were the budget version. Knockoff cheddar squares or butter rounds were the go-to snack when the real stuff cost too much. You got a giant box for half the price, and it lasted twice as long. The cheddar tasted more like powder. The butter was more like salt. But you ate them anyway. After school, on road trips, packed in lunches that were already running on a shoestring. These crackers filled the snack void when fresh fruit was too expensive and name brand anything was out of reach. Some kids dunked them in peanut butter. Others just munched straight from the box. They were dry, they were crunchy, and they were dependable. No one boasted about them, but no one threw them away either. They were part of the background noise of growing up poor, just another piece of the pantry puzzle that kept you full enough to get through the day. They were hard, chewy in the wrong way, sweet but not sweet enough. Generic cornflake cereal bars were the awkward cousin of granola bars. Cheaper, plainer, and always a little bit stale. But when you were short on time and short on money, they worked. You tossed them in backpacks and lunchboxes. You ate them in the car on the way to school. They filled you up just enough to make it to lunch. And at under $2 a box, they were easy to keep stocked. The flakes were always too crushed. The glaze was too thin. But they were better than nothing. That was the magic of them. You might not have loved them, but you always had them. They were the backup plan when the pantry was low and payday was still days away. A humble little snack that never tried to be more than it was. And that was exactly what made it matter. You tore the top off the packet, poured it into a chipped bowl, added hot water, and watched it puff up like magic. Generic brand instant oatmeal was the breakfast of necessity, warm, cheap, and endlessly repetitive. It came in huge cardboard boxes with 20 packets stuffed inside, and each one was a slightly sad version of something better. The flavor? A suggestion. Strawberries and cream had a pinkish dust that hinted at fruit. Maple brown sugar tasted like syrup someone had once thought about. But for kids getting ready for school and parents juggling paychecks, it was breakfast. And it was fast. It cooked in 2 minutes and filled your stomach for the next few hours, most of the time. The texture was always a little too runny or way too thick, depending on how careful you were with the water. But no one had time to be picky. It was food. It was warm. It was enough. You could find the store brand versions at every supermarket tucked right next to the name brand boxes that cost twice as much. If your family was counting pennies, and in the 1990s a lot of families were, that 50-cent difference mattered. These packets were the kind of thing you bought in bulk and rationed. Monday to Friday, maybe with toast if you had bread. Saturday mornings were the same, just in pajamas instead of school clothes. Sometimes you got creative, mixing packets together. One apple cinnamon, one plain, or adding your own sugar when the packet just didn't cut it. Parents liked them because they were simple. Just boil water or heat milk. No pans, no cleanup, no real cooking. And kids ate them because there was not much else. The better flavors always ran out first. The plain ones sat at the bottom of the box like sad reminders. But even those were better than nothing. You ate this stuff when mornings were rushed, when groceries were low, when you needed something you could trust. And even though it got old fast, There was something about that little packet that made you feel taken care of. You knew someone had made sure there was food in the house, even if it was the bottom shelf kind. It was predictable, it was reliable, and it was always there when you needed it. Generic instant oatmeal might not have been exciting, but it got you through. It came in a small cardboard box, barely heavier than a stack of coupons, but it promised something close to dessert. Generic boxed pudding mix was one of those pantry staples that felt like a luxury when everything else tasted like struggle. You did not need eggs, you did not need butter, just milk and thyme, and sometimes you did not even need that much. Chocolate and butterscotch were the usual flavors, and let's be honest, half the time you could not even taste a difference. The powders looked almost identical, smelled like a candy bar that had been left out in the sun and clumped if you were not careful while whisking. You mixed it in a pot if you had time to cook it, or used the instant version that thickened in the fridge. That was always the trick. Waiting the full 5 minutes. Not eating it too early while it was still half liquid. It never looked like the picture on the box, but it was cold, sweet, and smooth enough to pass as real pudding. For broke families in the 1990s, this was dessert. This was what you brought to a birthday if you could not swing cake. This was what you made when someone did well in school, or when you needed to stretch dinner into something that felt a little more like care. Add a scoop of generic whipped topping, and it was almost fancy. Sometimes moms poured it into little plastic containers for school lunches. Other times, it was just served in the pot with a spoon and a reminder not to eat it all at once. It made people feel good, even if it only cost 50 cents. And for parents trying to stretch every grocery dollar, boxed pudding mix was a win. It kept for months. It only needed milk. It gave you something sweet when life felt anything but. It reminded you that small treats still counted, that you did not need to have a lot to give something that made a kid smile. Chocolate or butterscotch, name brand or knockoff pudding mix was more than dessert. It was a reminder that joy could still live in the cupboard even during the hardest weeks. They wobbled, they sweated in your lunchbox, and they peeled open with a slurp that let everyone around you know what you were about to eat. Off-brand gelatin cups were the cheap snack that pretended to be fun, and sometimes actually was. They came in bright plastic containers with foil lids that tore halfway and got your fingers sticky. Grape tasted like purple cough syrup. Cherry was the safest bet, and even that was hit or miss. It looked like dessert. It was cold, it was colorful, and it was affordable. For broke families, that was enough. You could get a six-pack for under $1, and it made 5 days of school lunches feel a little more exciting. Kids would trade them, or use them as bargaining chips in the cafeteria. Because without them, lunch was just a sandwich and whatever was left in the pantry. You never really knew what was in them. But they were consistent, and they were yours. You could poke them with a spoon or slurp them straight from the cup. You could freeze them into makeshift popsicles. The moment someone saw one, it was gone by dinner. Parents bought them because they were cheap, and everyone knew they would be back on the shopping list next week. Flavored gelatin cups might have been low-rent snacks, but they were small, bright spots in the daily routine. And when life felt heavy, that silly little wobble made everything feel a bit lighter. It came in a container the size of a fire extinguisher, usually with a sticky handle and a faded label. Store-brand syrup in giant plastic jugs was not maple, not even close. But in the 1990s, if you were poor and needed something to pour on pancakes, waffles, or even toast, this was it. Thick, dark, and weirdly glossy, it oozed more than it poured. The taste? Pure sugar with a hint of something trying to be maple. And this stuff gave you a gallon of sweetness for the price of a pint. It lasted forever. A little went a long way, mostly because it was so overpowering. Pancakes made from box mix? Drench them. Generic oatmeal? Stir it in and call it a win. Some people even used it in coffee when there was no sugar left. Others mixed it into peanut butter, and it was always in the back of the fridge or on a sticky pantry shelf. Parents loved it because it stretched. Kids loved it because it was sweet. That was just how it worked. This syrup did not pretend to be fancy. It was for families who needed calories, not prestige. And even though it was not real maple syrup, it was real enough for the people who used it every day. The jar sat in the fridge like a quiet utility player. No spotlight, no flair, but always ready to show up when needed. Store-brand mayonnaise was one of those things that made everything else work. But it was cheaper, and in a tight grocery week, that made it a hero. It came in plastic tubs with clunky lids and labels that tried to look modern but felt like 1970s clip art. The texture was a little off, and the flavor was just enough to pass for the real thing if you did not think too hard about it. You mixed it into tuna to stretch a pouch. You smeared it on sandwiches made with discount lunch meat and bargain bread. You used it to make pasta salad out of elbow noodles and a can of peas. You could doll it up with mustard or pickles. Some people turned it into dip. It was not something you showed off. It was something you used. And when money was low and options were few, store-brand mayonnaise became one of those invisible ingredients that helped the family keep eating. No one praised it. No one gave it awards. But it was there, every day. Just like the people who made it work. Frozen TV dinners were not just a treat, they were a plan. You opened that silver tray and saw a whole meal, meat, starch, vegetable, and something pretending to be dessert. It all cooked at once, in the oven, slowly, while you sat cross-legged on the carpet staring at your favorite show. Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, corn, and a brownie fused to the corner of the tray. It was hot lava on the outside and frozen in the middle. You stirred and waited and stirred again. But when it was finally ready, it felt like restaurant night. And you were the guest. Some came in boxes with wild colors and fake chefs smiling on the front. Others were just plain, store-brand, cheaper, always a little freezer-burned. It did not matter. They were the rare dinner you did not have to share or serve, your own personal tray of grown-up food. It made you feel fancy, even when you were sitting in pajamas on the shag carpet. You got to eat in front of the television. That was the real treat. In a time when family dinners were the rule, TV dinners were the exception. A little box of quiet, solo satisfaction. And when money was tight, they were a way to feed everyone. No mess, no fuss, no leftovers. Bouillon cubes were tiny blocks of magic that turned water into soup. You dropped one into a pot, stirred, and suddenly had broth. It was salty, concentrated, and packed with more flavor than you expected. You used it to stretch a can of soup, to season rice, or to make gravy when there was no meat. It lived in the back of the spice cabinet, usually wrapped in foil and a little bit dusty. You never used just one. You always added a second for good measure. It was your secret weapon when there was nothing but starch and hope in the kitchen. A cube in hot water meant something warm to sip, something to pour over instant potatoes, something that felt like more than it was. It gave canned vegetables more life. It made casseroles taste like they simmered all day. You crumbled it with your fingers when the knife drawer was already a mess. It was small enough to forget, but big enough to save dinner. You could buy a dozen cubes for less than $1, and they kept for years. It was comfort concentrated into a foil wrapper. No one talked about it, but everyone used it. Bouillon was not glamorous, but it knew its place and served it well. Bouillon was not a meal, but it made a meal feel like it had a soul. In the 1970s, it was how you gave dinner a backbone, one cube at a time. Before the controversy caught up with it, Sambo's was everywhere. And for a time in the 1970s, it was one of the biggest names in breakfast. Open early, often late, and always ready with a stack of pancakes dripping in syrup. It was the kind of place families stopped at on the way to road trips or for Saturday mornings that started a little too early. The vibe was laid back, kid-friendly, and comfortable. Bright booths, illustrated menus, and pancakes that somehow tasted better when eaten with plastic syrup containers shaped like bears. The food was affordable, the service was fast, and the portions were just shy of excessive, which is exactly what breakfast lovers wanted. Their branding leaned hard on storytelling, and while the original theme is undeniably problematic today, it reflected a different time when restaurants leaned into mascots and backstories to create an identity. But for a lot of kids back then, it was just the place where they got chocolate chip pancakes and a chocolate milk with a swirly straw. And the thing is, the food held its own. The pancakes were genuinely good. The eggs were reliable. The hash browns were crispy, and the coffee was hot, which is all anyone really asks of a breakfast joint. At its peak, Sambo's was not just a restaurant. It was part of the morning routine for countless families, the kind of place you returned to because it felt like a tradition. And while its legacy is a complicated one, there is no denying that for a few years in the 1970s, Sambo's helped define what going out for breakfast looked like across America. There were no signs, no trails, and definitely no cell reception. Not that it mattered. The hidden fishing hole Dad always took you to might as well have been a secret passed down through generations. You had to park on a dirt shoulder, hop a barbed wire fence, and walk through brush that snagged at your socks like it wanted you to turn back. But then, there it was. A quiet patch of water framed by trees and pure silence. No people, just frogs, the buzz of dragonflies, and the occasional splash of something just out of sight. Dad would hand you a rod, already rigged, and say, "Let's see if they're biting today," like it was a ritual. He always had a story about the one that got away, usually involving a fish the size of your leg and a broken line. You never saw it, but you believed him. And on the days you did catch something, even if it was just a bluegill the size of a cookie, he would hoot and holler like you had just pulled up Moby Dick. You would sit there side by side, quiet except for the occasional snack or Dad humming an old tune. But if you want to hear about the reward after a good fishing trip, let me take you to the drive-through dairy farm. Glass bottles, cold milk, and maybe even ice cream. High Karate aftershave was a joke and a phenomenon all at once. It came in a cheap bottle with a commercial that turned masculinity into a parody of itself. Spray this on, and women would attack you. Literally. The ads were absurd, over the top, and completely unforgettable. But behind the humor was a surprisingly decent scent. High Karate became the go-to for teenage boys trying to smell grown-up and grown men trying to stay playful. It was the cologne you found in your dad's drawer next to the tie clips and old movie stubs. But the joke wore thin. Trends shifted. The 1980s wanted power and polish, not camp and chaos. High Karate was quietly discontinued. Stores stopped stocking it. The bottles became rare. Today, it is a punchline for some and a scent memory for others. A whiff of what it meant to be young, to be bold, to believe that a fragrance could change everything. Hair straighteners with lye were the beauty industry's harshest secret, one that sat in bathrooms across the country disguised as progress. These chemical relaxers promised sleek, shiny hair with just a few burns on the side. The active ingredient? Sodium hydroxide, also known as lye, also known as the stuff used to clear clogged drains. It worked by literally breaking down your hair's natural bonds and rebuilding them into a straighter shape. You'd slather it on, wait with burning ears and stinging eyes, then rinse and pray your scalp still had skin. It was marketed as a home solution, with smiling women on the box, but behind the scenes, stylists kept tubs of petroleum jelly nearby to treat the inevitable chemical burns. The instructions said to leave it on for X minutes, but that depended on your pain tolerance. Lye burns didn't just hurt, they lingered. And if you left it on too long, hair fell out in clumps. The bathroom would fill with a sharp chemical scent, and your towel would be lined with strands. But the sleek results were addicting. You'd endure the pain for the promise of a smoother silhouette. And while your head might sting, your lunchbox could have been slowly serving up a whole other kind of danger. Schiaparelli perfumes once lived in the same breathless league as Chanel and Dior. With their surrealist bottles and bold floral compositions, they brought high fashion to the dressing tables of everyday American women. It was not just a scent, it was a statement. In the 1970s, Schiaparelli's legacy still lingered, but America was shifting. Fashion was getting younger, louder, and more synthetic. The brand struggled to adapt. Department stores gave shelf space to trendier, punchier names. The old-world elegance of Schiaparelli felt out of step in a decade of disco and denim. And somewhere along the way, the company let go of its American foothold. Licensing fell apart. Distribution waned. What had once been a symbol of European sophistication became something whispered about in vintage shops. Women who once dabbed it on before dinner parties now found their favorite scents discontinued, forgotten. For some, it was just a bottle, but for others, it was identity. A sense of self wrapped in rose and bergamot, and losing that, quietly, without warning, felt like losing a part of the woman they once were. Frozen fish sticks were not fancy, but they did their job. They came in a blue box stacked like lumber, each one coated in a pale orange breading that barely stayed on. You lined them up on a baking sheet, flipped them once, and hoped for golden. But even if they came out mushy or burned, nobody complained. It was fish, it was hot, and it was dinner. The inside was mystery meat from the sea, white, flaky, and barely seasoned. But with ketchup or tartar sauce, perfectly acceptable. Sometimes you got lucky and they actually crisped up. Other times they fused to the pan and had to be pried off with a spatula. In the 1970s, a box of pancake mix was more than a shortcut. It was a way to turn nothing into something. Economy pancake mix didn't just save breakfast, it saved mornings. Macaroni and cheese in a box was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, everyone had that orange powder in the cupboard. Boil the pasta, drain it, and stir in butter, milk, and the neon dust. It was dinner in minutes. Some added extras. Most just ate it as is, because it was fast, cheap, and somehow comforting. The cheese sauce was barely cheese, but you loved it anyway. You scraped the pot with a wooden spoon until there was nothing left to lick. Sometimes you added hot dogs, peas, or canned tuna to make it stretch. You never read the directions. You just made it the way your family always had. Even when it clumped or turned runny, it still tasted like home. It filled the kitchen with a smell that said, "You're going to be okay tonight." Kids asked for seconds, and there was rarely enough for leftovers. It stuck to the spoon, clung to the bowl, and stained your tongue if you ate enough of it. In the 1970s, boxed mac and cheese was how you made sure the kids ate something hot, even when the fridge was almost empty. It was shelf-stable, kid-friendly, and budget-approved. Nobody cared that it was not real cheese. They cared that it was there when you needed it. Mac and cheese from a box was not just food. It was a plan that always worked. If you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you either had a birthday at Shakey's Pizza or knew someone who did. This was not just another pizza place. It was a full-on experience. Walk in and you were met with the clatter of trays, the smell of garlic, and live banjo music that made you feel like you had wandered into a Western saloon. With pepperoni. Shakey's was loud, a little chaotic, and totally perfect for families. Communal tables meant you might be sitting next to someone you had never met before, and that was part of the fun. You shared space, laughter, and slices of that crispy, thin crust pizza that somehow always had the perfect crunch. Add in pitchers of root beer or beer depending on your age, and it was a celebration from start to finish. This was not date night pizza. This was messy, saucy, no-frills fun. You were not there to be quiet. You were there to have a good time. And if you were lucky, you might catch a glimpse of the kitchen through the glass, giant dough balls being tossed, toppings flying, ovens glowing. It was the kind of place that kids adored and parents tolerated. But deep down, everyone left full and happy. Because no matter how much sauce ended up on your shirt or how many quarters you spent at the arcade machine, it all added up to memories. Shakey's was not built for subtlety. It was built for joy, noise, and big tables filled with people who just wanted a slice and a good time. And in the 1970s, it nailed that mission like nobody else. The dented can discount grocery store was the kind of place you never admitted shopping at, unless you were dad. Then it was a badge of honor. You did not bring a list here. You brought instincts. Aisles of unlabeled tins, faded labels, and cardboard signs scribbled in permanent marker, 10 cans for $1. What cans? Who knew? Dad would hold one up and say, "Beef chunks and gravy." Sounds promising, like he was about to enter it in a cooking competition. Most of the time it was mystery meat roulette, but we were not there for the menu. We were there for the thrill. He treated the whole store like an auction. Name brand beans, "Get them while they last," he would whisper, like a man uncovering buried treasure. At checkout, he would proudly announce how much he saved. Never mind the fact that dinner might be spaghetti and something we would call tomato adjacent. You learned to laugh, to try everything once, and to realize a meal made on the cheap still meant you had one. But for a different kind of treasure, tucked away in someone's garage, let me tell you about the model train shop that made time stand still. There was a moment in time when Betamax by Sony felt like the future. It had better video quality, a sleeker build, and came from a company America respected. But the future is not always decided by quality. It is decided by marketing, accessibility, and sometimes dumb luck. As families across the United States tried to tape late-night movies and birthday parties, VHS was waiting in the wings with longer record times and cheaper manufacturing. Sony clung to Betamax like it was a crown jewel, refusing to open the format to other producers. Meanwhile, JVC made sure VHS was everywhere. Department stores, rental shops, even those weird catalogs your uncle subscribed to. Betamax became the expensive outsider, and slowly, painfully, it vanished. What makes it worse is how many people swore it was better. You hear it even now, that Betamax was sharper, that it deserved to win, but it did not, and the shelves emptied and the VCRs were unplugged. We talk a lot about technology moving too fast, but this was a case of the better tech losing the race. People did not just throw out a tape, they threw out a bet on something they believed in. That loss still stings for those who remember. Lawn chemicals with DDT were sprayed across suburban America like miracle dust. In the 1970s, lush green grass was practically a status symbol, and DDT was the secret weapon. It promised to kill bugs, weeds, and just about anything that dared disturb your tidy front yard. Garden hoses were connected to chemical sprayers, and entire blocks smelled like synthetic citrus and poison. Nobody warned you to stay inside. In fact, kids ran barefoot through freshly treated lawns, chasing sprinklers and dodging dandelions while their skin soaked in the residue. Pets rolled in it, parents barbecued on it, and when rain hit, those chemicals went straight into the sidewalk gutters. DDT had already raised alarms in scientific circles, but in neighborhoods everywhere, it was just another tool in the garage. The packaging featured sunny lawns and happy families, not skulls or warnings. It wasn't uncommon to see a bottle of weed killer sitting on the porch next to the lemonade. By the late 1970s, it was banned for agricultural use in the United States. But traces lingered in soil and water for years. It affected birds, fish, children, pretty much everything it touched. Today, DDT is infamous for its lasting environmental impact and connection to declining wildlife populations. But back then, it was just part of Saturday chores. And if your lawn didn't smell like chemicals, your furniture definitely did. Boxed macaroni and cheese was not just dinner. It was a budget strategy. The box cost less than $1 and could feed an entire family if you got creative. Elbow noodles, a packet of neon orange powder, and a splash of milk, if you had it. If not, water worked. Maybe some margarine, maybe not. You stirred and stirred until it turned into something thick, hot, and just cheesy enough. It was not gourmet, but it was fast, filling, and guaranteed nobody would complain. Much. Sometimes you added chopped hot dogs or canned tuna. Other times it was just mac and cheese and a prayer. The box said, "Serves 4," but you could stretch it to 6 if you were desperate. It was not about flavor, it was about making sure everyone got a scoop. The powder never fully dissolved, the noodles always clumped. But it hit the spot in a way that made you feel like you were getting away with something. There were no gourmet breadcrumbs, no truffle oil, just a pot, a box, and a wooden spoon. If you were lucky, you got the store brand. 10 cents cheaper and twice as clumpy. You made it after school. You made it at midnight. You made it when payday was still too far away. In the 1970s, boxed mac and cheese was not a side dish. It was the whole meal. And somehow, it always did the job. Economy bacon ends, and pieces were not pretty, but they were still bacon. You did not get neat strips. You got chunks, scraps, and the fatty leftovers that stores could not sell any other way. But they were smoky, salty, and cheap. You cooked them slow to melt the fat, then saved the grease for later. They popped and sizzled and filled the kitchen with the smell of something special. You chopped them into beans, stirred them into scrambled eggs, or sprinkled them over a potato to make it feel like more. Sometimes they were mostly fat. Sometimes you got a good piece. But every bite counted. You knew exactly what to do with them, even if no recipe ever called for them. They made Sunday breakfast feel a little more like a celebration. You could stretch a single handful across 3 meals if you played it right. Even the drippings were sacred. You saved every drop in an old coffee can. They crisped up in a cast iron pan better than anything else. They weren't made for photo spreads. They were made for survival. Every greasy splatter on the stove was proof that you had something hot on the table. They were greasy and irregular and absolutely necessary. In a time when full strips cost too much, bacon ends were how you kept the flavor without the price. You did not care what it looked like. You cared what it did. Economy bacon ends were not about presentation. They were about making breakfast feel like a win. There is weird. Then there is steaming hot dogs and beer weird. That was the calling card of Lum's, a restaurant chain that bet big on novelty and came up short. In theory, it sounded just quirky enough to work. A hot dog, simmered in beer, topped with your favorite fixings, served up in a cozy diner-style setting. But in practice? Well, let us just say no one was rushing home to recreate it. Lum's was born in the 1950s, but it hit its stride in the 1970s. The vibe was somewhere between casual diner and chain experiment. They had chili dogs, sandwiches, roast beef platters, and of course that beer-steamed dog. It was supposed to be the thing that made them different. And it was. Just not in the way they hoped. People were not quite sure what to make of it. The beer flavor was subtle at best, odd at worst, and because the beer was fully cooked off, it had zero buzz and all the funk. Combine that with uneven quality across locations and a menu that never quite settled into a rhythm, and Lum's started losing its charm. Even the fact that Milton Berle did commercials for them could not save it. Ownership changed hands, concepts were shuffled, and eventually most locations either closed or were turned into something else entirely. Lum's had heart. It had personality. But personality does not always translate into staying power, especially when your signature dish confuses more people than it impresses. A beer-steamed hot dog might grab attention once, but it takes more than a gimmick to keep the grill hot. The used bookstore with the ham radios in the back was the kind of place where time folded in on itself. You walked in and the smell hit you first. Paper, dust, and something that might have been pipe smoke from 50 years ago. Dad would head for the nonfiction section like it was a treasure map, and you would start flipping through comics that had long-forgotten characters in them. Every wall was covered in books, stacked too deep, sometimes sideways, sometimes just crammed in with no regard for order. But the real secret was in the back room. That was where the ham radios lived. Static buzzed from old speakers, and every now and then a voice would crackle through saying something like, "Calling from Connecticut. Do you copy?" Dad would nod slowly, say, "Nice rig," and start talking shop with the owner like they were part of some invisible club. You never understood a word of it, but it felt cool anyway, like your dad knew something no one else did. He would pick up a radio, fiddle with a dial, and say, "This one's got personality." The man behind the counter always nodded like that meant something. But if you thought that place had character, wait until you see Dad at the county auction barn, outbidding strangers for a box of who knows what. Before it made video game history, Coleco was just trying to survive. The Connecticut Leather Company, yes, that is what Coleco stood for, started with shoes and evolved into above-ground pools, plastic toys, and electronic gadgets. In the 1970s, it was everywhere, but it was never dominant, always chasing trends. Then came the video game boom. ColecoVision arrived and gave the company its first real taste of national success. The graphics were better, the games felt fresh. For a brief moment in the early 1980s, Coleco looked unstoppable. It felt like they had finally found their niche, a lane where they could lead instead of follow. But success came faster than the company could stabilize, but it did not last. The video game crash of 1983 hit like a hammer. Coleco overextended, banking on a market that evaporated almost overnight. It tried to pivot again, launching the Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, which sold in the millions. But lightning rarely strikes twice. Manufacturing problems, patent lawsuits, financial strain. By the end of the decade, Coleco was bankrupt, sold off, dismantled, and the dreams of a plastic empire turned to dust. For anyone who grew up in that era, Coleco was part of the magic, part of the joy, part of the fall. Lead-based house paint was on everything, from the trim around your bedroom window to the alphabet blocks you chewed on. It came in brilliant colors: fire engine red, bright yellow, deep green. The more vibrant, the more lead. It was marketed as durable and washable, perfect for messy kids. And boy, did it chip. You'd peel it off windowsills out of boredom or scrape it with your nails without thinking twice. It crumbled into dust that settled into the carpet, got tracked into kitchens, and ended up in the air. Small hands touched it, then mouths. It didn't smell weird. It didn't taste odd. It just quietly poisoned millions of children across the country, lowering IQs and increasing behavioral issues without a single obvious symptom. Entire neighborhoods, especially older ones, were coated in the stuff. Lead paint wasn't banned in residential use until 1978, and even after that, it stayed in homes for decades. Removing it required hazmat suits and special permits. And still, many families had no idea it was even there. It was a silent danger, one that hid in plain sight and looked great doing it. And while the walls might have been risky, the pajamas you wore to bed came with their own fire-breathing surprise. You dipped them in ranch, hot sauce, or whatever condiment was closest. You ate them with fingers, forks, or just a folded piece of bread. Leftovers never happened. They were always gone. Even cold, they worked. And when payday was still a week away, they felt like a small win. You ate them with instant mashed potatoes and canned peas, and it felt like a real meal, especially if you were not paying attention to taste. Moms loved them because they were cheap, frozen, and lasted months. Kids loved them because they looked like nuggets. You dipped, crunched, and finished the whole plate before even asking what kind of fish it was. Nobody knew. It did not matter. In a home where real fillets were too expensive, frozen fish sticks gave you a seat at the table and a full belly by bedtime. Dry egg noodles in cellophane bags were the unsung hero of the pantry. You could get a whole bag for less than $1, and they could turn into just about anything. They boiled fast, held sauce well, and didn't need anything but a little margarine and salt to be considered dinner. If you had canned soup, they went in. If you had leftover meat, they soaked it up. They were soft, simple, and endlessly forgiving. You didn't read recipes, you cooked by feel, by habit, by hunger, and somehow those plain old noodles came out just right. They were the background singer in 100 family dinners. You could stretch them over multiple nights or serve them all at once when company came by. Sometimes you buttered them with pepper and called it done. Other times you baked them into casseroles that fed a crowd. They were bland, yes, but also blank, ready for anything. No one praised the noodles, but no one left the table hungry. In the 1970s, this was your food safety net, cheap, filling, and flexible. Dry egg noodles were not a luxury, but they were a lifeline. Once upon a time, Schrafft's was the place to be. Polished silverware, waitresses in crisp uniforms, and menus with elegant script. It was high-end dining for the everyday person, a little treat, a step up from the usual. But by the time the 1970s rolled around, that old-school glamour had started to feel, well, old. Schrafft's was famous for its desserts, sure, but it also had charm, chandeliers, tablecloths, and a vibe that made you want to mind your manners. The food leaned classic. Turkey dinners, creamed spinach, and lemon meringue pie served with pride. For decades, it catered mostly to women, shoppers, lunch dates, special occasions. And it worked. But the world changed. Fast food was rising. Counter service was in. Schrafft's stayed stuck in the past, clinging to formality while the rest of the dining scene loosened its tie. Younger diners saw it as their grandmother's restaurant. Older customers stopped going out as often. The customer base aged, and the company never adapted. Even when Schrafft's tried to modernize, adding lounges, slimming menus, simplifying service, it felt too little, too late. The essence of the brand had already slipped away. One by one, locations closed. And soon, all that remained was a faded memory of chocolate sundaes in chilled glass cups and servers who called you ma'am. Schrafft's did not fail because it was bad. It failed because it stood still while everyone else kept walking. The Firehouse Pancake Breakfast was not just a fundraiser. It was a local holiday. Dad would wake you up early on a Sunday, say, "Put on your shoes." And before you could ask questions, you were in line behind a dozen people all craving the same thing, a plate piled high with pancakes. The folding chairs wobbled, the long tables had little dents and permanent syrup rings, and everything smelled like melted butter and maple sugar. Real maple syrup was a luxury, so they used the bottled kind, the kind that came out slow and stuck the lid shut like glue. Firefighters in aprons manned the griddles, flipping pancakes like they had trained for it. Dad would nod in approval, pile his plate, and crack a joke to someone in line about how this was the real breakfast of champions. Dad never won, but he always bought 5 tickets just in case. It was not about the pancakes, really. It was about community, about showing up. And when breakfast was over, he would say, "Let's make a stop on the way back." That stop? Usually a roadside museum with one very questionable claim to fame. If any of these humble groceries brought back a memory, or reminded you what it really meant to make do, drop your story in the comments. Give this video a like if it made you nod once, and subscribe so we can keep telling the truth about how we got by.